So welcome to our current panel, Psychology and Anthropology, Self-Knowledge and Consciousness. At least that's what I hope you think it is, because it is. So the program is a little bit in error. We have delightfully 3 panelists. With an event this large, there's always some changes and reshufflings. But what we're going to do is go with the 2 that are in the printed version, and then Jeremy Skrzypek will present last. So first up, we have Daniel Contreras, who's assistant professor of philosophy at the University of the Andes. He was a proud product of Notre Dame.
Yes.
And he will be speaking to us on Anima, essentiam, suam, videt, Aquinas and the light of the agent intellect and the soul's habitual knowledge.
Thank you very much. Okay, 20 minutes. In the 13th century landscape of philosophical and theological reflection, Aquinas' theory of human self-knowledge occupies a rather particular place. While hearkening to Augustine's authority, who had famously claimed that the soul always knows itself, and that in the search to understand itself, it strives after the knowledge of something that had nonetheless always been present to itself, Aquinas refuses, as is known, to accept the existence of something like a superconscious self-knowledge that is always present to the soul and that would grant to the soul some kind of perpetual, though vague and confusing knowledge of itself, regardless of the knowledge of extramental objects. Following Aristotle's cue from the De Anima, Aquinas thinks that the human soul is intelligible like all other intelligibles, and so requires for the actual cognition of itself of a species of some extramental thing. Nevertheless, Aquinas does think throughout his entire literary production, but especially from the Veritate onwards, that despite not having this kind of superconscious self-knowledge that many of his predecessors and contemporaries advocated, the human soul is in fact, in some sense, always present to itself, knowing itself habitually in an uninterrupted manner. The nature of this habitual self-knowledge, however, is disputed among contemporary scholars. Some authors think that the soul's habitual self-knowledge is a vague and implicit knowledge that merely accompanies all our acts of cognition, but that is not always cognitively or intentionally present to itself, conveying any kind of real, meaningful content as to the nature and contours of the human soul. Other authors think that the soul's habitual self-knowledge is nothing but the potency or capacity to perform acts of self-knowledge once the conditions for actualization are met, above all the actual knowledge of some extramental object, but that it is not an actual real knowledge in the sense of providing some essential content. It is merely a capacity or potency for actual self-knowledge. Others conceive of it in quite the same manner in which other 13th century scholastics advocated for a kind of superconscious self-knowledge. That is, a knowledge that the soul always has of itself, but that is never thematized or objectified in the sense of being made the direct object of attention or consideration. This means for these authors that when the soul actually pays attention to itself, it performs an act of self-knowledge that is fundamentally different from the superconscious knowledge that it always has of itself. Others finally think of the soul's habitual self-knowledge in more metaphysical terms, highlighting the unique ontological condition of the human soul. Cory, for example, recognizes this when she claims that habitual self-knowledge belongs to the essence of the intellectual soul, but refuses to explicitly go any further. What I would like to defend here today is precisely a more robust metaphysical conception of Aquinas' understanding of the soul's habitual knowledge. What it postulates is that the human soul's habitual self-knowledge is the native ontological self-presence in which the human soul subsists as an immaterial, intelligible substance. The human soul's habitual self-knowledge is, in other words, the substantial and immaterial actus essendi in and through which the human soul subsists. This radical and intimate self-presence in which the human soul immaterially subsists is the very light of the agent intellect that makes or constitutes the intelligibles, and so it is the ground and root of every act of self-knowledge that the soul performs whenever it knows an extramental object. This identification between the agent intellect and the soul's habitual self-knowledge certainly requires explanations and nuances, easily lending itself to misinterpretations. The question that leads to the following pages then concerns the ontological status of the agent intellect and the soul's habitual self-knowledge, being both, as we here maintain, the very same actuality by means of which the soul is radically and habitually present to itself, and which makes or constitutes all other intelligibles. The first section is habitual self-knowledge and the agent intellect. In the Veritate, question 10, article 8, which is Aquinas' longest treatment of the soul's habitual self-knowledge, Aquinas replies to an objection raised against the idea that the soul knows itself through its own essence and not by means of a species, and this is text 1 in the handout. The objection had argued that the human soul is a certain substance that for that very reason subsists in itself, but intelligible forms of which all knowledge and science is made up are not substances that subsist in themselves, but rather accidents. Therefore, if the soul were that through which the soul knows itself, that is, if the soul acted as the intelligible form for the knowledge it has of itself, then it would be an accident as all other intelligible forms are, and this, of course, is impossible. Aquinas replies that the knowledge whereby the soul knows itself, and this is text 2, the reply, is not in the genus of accident with regard to that by means of which it habitually knows itself. Aquinas replies that the knowledge whereby the soul knows itself, notitia qua anima essentiam novit, is not in the genus of accident with regard to that by means of which it habitually knows itself, quantum ad id quo habitualiter cognoscitur. It is certainly in the genus of accident, but only with regard to the act of knowledge, solum quantum ad actum cognitionis. If the knowledge whereby the soul knows itself is not in the genus of accident, the only logical conclusion is that it must necessarily belong to the genus of substance. But then the question is obvious. What does it mean for the soul's habitual self-knowledge to be in the category of substance? Or more generally posed, what does it mean for any knowledge to be in the category of substance? As is known, Aquinas repeatedly appeals to the authority of Augustine when dealing with this matter. He does so, as a matter of fact, in the response just quoted from the Veritate question 10, article 8. In book 9 of the De Trinitate, Augustine postulates a fundamental distinction between the soul's knowing itself, se nose, and the soul's thinking about itself, se cogitare. When the soul thinks about itself, it pays attention to itself, it turns inwards onto itself, and it makes itself the direct object of cognition. But when it simply knows itself, se nose, it does not objectify itself, making itself the direct object of cognition, but is rather simply present to itself as, in Aquinas' later terminology, an immaterial intellectual substance. As Aquinas says at the end of the reply just mentioned, quoting Augustine, the knowledge whereby the soul knows itself is in the soul as a substance, substantialiter, and not as an accident. The soul's se nose, then, seems to be for Augustine nothing but the very essence of the soul, as it is continuously self-aware, that is, in substantial unity with itself. This explains why Augustine remarks that even before actually thinking about itself, the soul had always known itself, for it is always held or retained in its own presence as an intellectual substance. Aquinas willingly adopts Augustine's line of thought, though he complements it and modifies it with the recently gained Aristotelian insights concerning human psychology and intellection. This helps explain why, even as early as in De Veritate, Aquinas simultaneously holds that the human soul is intelligible like all other intelligibles, and that it nonetheless habitually knows itself in a continuous manner. In the Veritate question 10, article 8, Aquinas distinguishes between the soul's existential or experiential self-knowledge and the soul's quiditative self-knowledge. This second kind of knowledge, the one that is acquired regarding the nature of the soul, requires, unsurprisingly, making the intellective soul the direct object of consideration, and is the result of rather intricate philosophical reasoning, which also takes time and is prone to errors. The first kind of self-knowledge, however, is the knowledge the soul has regarding what is particular to itself, quantum ad id quod est ei proprium, or as Aquinas also phrases it, inasmuch as the soul has being in a particular individual, secundum quod habet esse in tali individuo. By means of this knowledge, the soul knows that it exists, and one perceives oneself as the subject of one's operations. But this can take place in two ways, says Aquinas, actually and habitually. To habitually know itself means for the soul to see itself by means of its own essence, that is, to be always present to itself through its own essence, so that it can proceed to an act of self-knowledge, just as it similarly happens with the one who has the habit of a certain science, who can, by the sheer presence of that habit, know in act the things that belong to that science when he actualizes that knowledge. On account of this self-presence, then, which is characteristic of intellectual substances, we do not know what we are, but we do know that we are. This self-presence is characteristic of us as intellectual substances because we subsist in and through intellectual or intelligible being, esse intelligibile. The human substance or essence, formally constituted by the intellective soul as its formal principle, is transcendentally ordered to its being as to the act that perfects it and brings it into existence. This being, inasmuch as it is not entirely immersed and restricted by the conditions of matter, is intellectual being, and is, following Aquinas' reasoning here, the soul's habitual self-awareness inasmuch as it has being in a particular individual. But precisely because this being is always intelligible actuality, and thus the ultimate ground for the intimate and radical self-presence of the soul, it is also and simultaneously the very light of the agent intellect that makes or constitutes the intelligible. All these descriptions of intellectual or intelligible being, two sides of the same metaphysical reality, pick out the same reality under different names. Inasmuch as it brings forth into existence the human soul, which is the formal principle of the human composite, it is the substantial and immaterial act of being, actus essendi, that actualizes the human essence, and in and through the soul informs the body. Inasmuch as it constitutes the human soul as an immaterially subsisting substance, this intelligible being is the soul's habitual self-awareness, that is, the continual abiding presence of the human soul unto itself. And inasmuch as it grants the soul the intelligible actuality, whereby to make potential intelligible objects actually intelligible, it is the light of the agent intellect. The soul's habitual self-knowledge, then, is not a superadded perfection that accrues to the human soul and inheres in it in the manner of an accident, like the knowledge of all other things. It is rather made possible, as Aquinas says here, by the very sheer fact that the soul's essence is present unto itself, and it is not, as we saw Aquinas saying above, in the genus of an accident, but is in the mind substantialiter. This means then that in the case of the human soul, the radical capacity for conscious self-possession, which is characteristic of habitual self-knowledge, is found there substantially, since it is constituted by the soul's very substantial being. For the soul's habitual self-knowledge to belong to the category of substance is nothing else than to be identical with the soul, but this only to the extent that, or inasmuch as the soul, being an immaterial substance that subsists on its own, always has in itself intelligible being, esse intelligibile, but not as much as the soul is, which also and inseparably always is, form of a body. In knowing some extramental object, then, we realize that we are the ones who perform the operation of understanding. This realization cannot take place without knowing something, but that of which we become aware is not something that is thematically known, that is, as specifying our intellect with a determinate form or species, but is rather an unthematic or non-objectifying knowledge of our own existence. Although it is true that the soul behaves as a blank slate, tabula rasa, with regard to the cognition of sensible objects, with regard to the experiential knowledge it has of itself, the soul is always in the proper and perfect disposition in which a cognitive habit finds itself with regard to the actual connection of its corresponding objects, and this independently of any species received by abstraction from the senses. The actualization of this habit certainly requires the cognition of extramental material objects, but not as if the cognition of these objects were to constitute the very structure of intimate self-presence that truly defines the spirituality of the mind as such, but rather as the condition required by an immaterially subsisting soul that is nonetheless the form of a body. Therefore, the soul's habitual self-knowledge is not something like the possession of a quality, as one could say of the knowledge of all possible extramental objects, or a kind of inherent habit of the soul. The soul's habitual self-knowledge is rather the very substance of the soul, but only inasmuch as the human soul is an immaterial form whose being is not entirely immersed and restricted by the conditions of matter. To the extent that the being of the soul exceeds or goes above matter, it is naturally constituted so as to be intimately self-present to itself, that is, to habitually know itself. In other words, the human soul has in and of itself the radical disposition to perceive its own being before any sensitively received species, because the disposition is the very immaterial possession of its being as an intellectual substance. This disposition to move or proceed to the actual knowledge of itself is not an accident. It does not belong to the category of accidents, as Aquinas says, but instead is the very essence of the soul as consciously self-present to itself, since it immaterially subsists in esse intelligibile, that is, on account of having being in independence of matter. Now, to further clarify the true metaphysical nature of the soul's habitual self-knowledge, it is necessary to also address the ontological status of the agent intellect. Since the light of the agent intellect is the actuality whereby the soul makes the forms received from the senses intelligible in act, and which are for that very reason only potentially intelligible, it is too, as the soul's habitual self-knowledge, the esse intelligibile that actualizes the human soul and constitutes the soul radical self-presence unto itself. The human soul, according to Aquinas, is the least perfect among intellectual substances. This is why it does not understand any intelligible forms by merely relying on its own nature, but at first is rather an impotency regarding all of them. Hence, to actually acquire those forms, it must first assimilate or receive the likeness of the things that exist outside of itself by sensitive perception. This conception of the soul brings out the two main reasons for the need of the agent intellect, namely, that the power for understanding the essence of things, that is, the possible intellect, is at first entirely impotency regarding intelligibles, and consequently, that the acquisition of intelligible forms must be made through sensible forms, which are the similitudes of things as they exist in matter. To claim, as Aquinas repeatedly does, that the agent intellect is the act of the intelligibles, and through them of the possible intellect, may seem to commit Aquinas to identifying the agent intellect with the very act of the forms which have been immaterialized. The important thing to avoid this mistake is to keep in mind that for the agent intellect to be able to bring the phantasms and the possible intellect into act, it must be intelligible in act prior to bringing them into act, since nothing acts insofar as it is in potency, but only as it is in act. The agent intellect cannot be identified with the act of any given immaterialized form or with the act of the possible intellect. When Thomas says that the agent intellect is the act of the intelligibles themselves, he should not be seen as referring to the forms which have been in fact been made intelligible, unless we take him to denote of the cause by means of the effect. The agent intellect is the prerequisite act of the actual intelligibility of the natures presented by phantasms, and hence it must be in act prior to the actualization of any of them. Yet if the soul already has, before the immaterialization of any given form present in a phantasm, an intellectual power which is intelligible in act, how can it be said that the soul is at first entirely in potency regarding intelligibles, like a clean slate on which nothing is written? Thomas was very much aware of this difficulty. In the Summa contra Gentiles, he says, and this is text 3 in the handout, but it will perhaps appear to some that this is impossible, namely that one and the same substance, that is our soul, be in potency regarding all intelligibles, which corresponds to the possible intellect, and that it makes them in act, which is proper to the agent intellect. For nothing acts insofar as it is in potency, but insofar as it is in act. Wherefore it seems that the agent in possible intellect cannot coexist in the soul's one substance. This is a problem Thomas faced numerous times. The solution leads to a startling conception of the agent intellect. And its summary presentation is found in the Summa contra Gentiles, and this is text 4. The intellective soul has something in act regarding which the phantasm is in potency, and is in potency regarding that which is found in act in phantasms. For the substance of the soul has immateriality, and is evident from what has been said. For that reason it has an intellectual nature, because every immaterial substance is of this kind. But this does not just suffice for it to have what it takes to assimilate to this or that determined thing, which is required for our soul to know this or that determined thing. For all knowledge takes place through the similitude of what is known in the knower. Therefore, the intellective soul itself remains in potency regarding the determinate similitudes of things which are knowable by us, namely the natures of sensible things. In fact, phantasms present to us these determinate natures of sensible things. However, they have not yet attained intelligible being, esse intelligibile, given that they are similitudes of sensible things not only as to the material conditions, which are individual properties, but they are also immaterial organs. Consequently, they are not intelligible in act, yet they are intelligible in potency. Thus, they have intelligibility in potency, but they have the determination of the similitude of things in act. But the opposite was the case with the intellective soul. Hence, there is an active power in the intellective soul regarding phantasms, which makes them intelligible in act, and this potency of the soul is called the agent intellect. There is also in it a power which is potency regarding the determinate similitudes of sensible things, and this potency is the possible intellect. Thomas thinks therefore that the intellectual cognition of a thing requires that the soul and the natures presented by phantasms complement each other. The soul must provide the natures what they lack in order to become actually intelligible, while the natures provide the soul with what it lacks in order to become actually cognizing of a thing. What these natures lack, as Aquinas says in these passages, is not an essential determination or specification, but rather a distinctive kind of being, namely intelligible being, esse intelligibile. This means that what the soul bestows on the natures presented by the phantasms to make them intelligible in act is not a determination or property, that is something that changes what they are. Instead, leaving the same essential properties or attributes in place, the soul only provides those natures with the esse that elevates them to the immaterial and hence intelligible realm. Although Thomas does not make it fully explicit, there is an important conclusion to draw from this passage, namely that the agent intellect itself is esse intelligibile. The reasoning behind this conclusion is the following. Every agent acts through its form, and every agent acting through its form produces something similar to itself. For creatures, this means that a substance causes something through its form, and by doing so, it causes something to be like itself. Now, esse itself, and hence esse intelligibile, is itself a form. Aquinas repeatedly says that esse is formal with respect to everything else, and that God himself is, through his own essence, form. Since esse intelligibile is a form, and given that this form belongs to sensible natures only as they are acted upon by the soul, it follows that the esse intelligibile that accrues to them must be effected by the soul insofar as it operates through its own esse intelligibile. But since every agent acts through its own form, and since the esse intelligibile that is received by sensible natures is bestowed on them by the agent intellect, the form by means of which the human soul performs its operation must itself be esse intelligibile. The soul's actual intelligibility...
You're cutting into it.
Okay, sorry. I've just two more paragraphs. The soul's actual intelligibility, the fact that it always has esse intelligibility, is fully consistent with the soul's potentiality regarding all determined intelligible forms. For Aquinas, intelligibility is inextricably linked to immateriality. As he repeatedly affirms, something is intelligible in act because it is immaterial. The human soul is a spiritual, immaterial substance whose esse exceeds bodily matter. Insofar as it is not mixed with the body, then, it is intelligible in act. Given that the mind is immaterial and that intelligibility is inextricably linked to immateriality, it should be no surprise that for Aquinas the mind itself is intelligible in act. Intelligibility and immateriality go hand in hand, to the point that Thomas describes the very operation of the agent intellect, that is making intelligible sympodicy, be intelligible in act, as a conferral of immateriality. What is it exactly which the soul grants to sensible forms and that enters into composition with them so that they acquire actual intelligibility? In general terms, Aquinas distinguishes 6 ways in which something can enter into composition with something else. 1 as parts of one body, 2 as forms and matter, 3 as nature and subject, 4 as esse and essentia, 5 as genus and difference, and 6 as substance and accident. I'm going to skip some paragraphs, some lines. Given that the soul is in potency regarding all determined intelligible forms, what it bestows on sensible forms to make them intelligible in act cannot itself be a determinate form. Otherwise, the soul would be intelligible in act precisely with regard to that determinate form. It seems then that the only possible composition is that of esse and essentia. But since determined forms are not themselves esse but essentiae, what the soul effects on these forms and what enters into composition with them must be some kind of esse that makes them intelligible in act, namely esse intelligibile. Any actually intelligible form is not just a determinate form, but rather a composite of both determinate form and esse intelligibility. Just the conclusion. What the human intellect lacks for perpetual actual self-awareness is intrinsic intelligibility. The human intellect is not itself informed by its own essence. Whereas the angelic intellect is intrinsically intelligible, that is, its own essence informs its intellect as a specifying intelligible species, the human soul does not, by the sheer fact of subsisting immaterially, inform its intellect. The human soul informs a body precisely because it does not subsist perfectly in the genus of the intelligible. This ultimately means that the actuality by means of which intelligibility is granted to sensible species is the same actuality by means of which the soul is habitually present to itself. In other words, the reditio by means of which the human soul not only returns to itself, but also, and more importantly, subsists immaterially in itself, is also the very same light which makes or constitutes the intelligibles. One and the same esse intelligibile, considered and described under different perspective, grounds the soul's capacity to both be continuously present to itself and to render material objects intelligible in act. After all, if the intelligible actuality of any species that informs our intellect were not something connatural to the soul, how would we be able to recognize ourselves in the knowledge of everything else? If this actuality were not connatural to our soul, as its very own actus essendi, it would be impossible to recognize ourselves as the ones who understand.
Just about 6 minutes left for questions. Do you want to field your own questions, or would you like me to keep it here? I'll keep it. Stephen's here.
Thanks, Daniel. Very interesting. I've got a couple of historical points that might support your case, but I'll just mention one here, and I wondered if you had thought about it. So, in Aristotle's Anima 3:5, Aristotle says the active intellect of nous poietikos is a hexis, like light.
Yes.
And I believe it's probably translated into Latin as habitus.
Yes.
So I was wondering if that could support your idea here that the source of habitual knowledge, whatever it must be, is this kind of habitus, and the agent intellect is already called a habitus. Does that help your case at all?
So Aquinas usually sort of, whenever he talks about the soul's habitual self-knowledge, he compares it to a habit. He doesn't sort of describe it directly as a habit, but compares it. So it's similar to what a habit of science, for example, does for the one who has it. That by the sheer presence of the habit, he kind of can exceed it, so he can proceed to the knowledge, enact of that which belongs to the science. And similarly, by the fact of having an immaterial soul, that is though the form of a body, we can sort of have that disposition that can be actualized, and so that we can actually be aware of itself. So it behaves like a habit, but he doesn't directly describe it as a habit. But it helps, yeah.
John?
Okay. This is not a sophisticated historical question. I'm wondering about how this idea of the mind knowing itself, or the soul knowing itself, thought knowing itself, how that I exist, that knowledge that I exist, is similar to or different from the knowledge that I have that some particular human being exists. Like, I didn't know David, and then I met him, and so I came to know that there was David.
Yeah.
In the
Happy day for all of us.
right, the world was richer. I could have known some Leibnizian principle. In the version of this idea that we get from the tradition that follows from Descartes, it's the knowledge that some particular individual exists, and then there's the question of reasoning out from the knowledge that particular human individual exists with its thoughts. That substance exists to the existence of other substances.
Yeah.
And there's this other tradition that maybe Stephen knows very well, where thought knowing itself isn't the knowledge of some one being among others, or something that could be some one being among others. It's just thought knowing its very general character as thought. So maybe that's not a helpful division
Well,
stated,
so
but I'm wondering
it's
how...
important because, so Aquinas, when he talks about the soul's habitual self-knowledge, it's always I don't know how to say this in English, kind of a non-thematic or unthematic knowledge. So it's not the knowledge of sort of some essential content. So when you know the existence of somebody else, there's always some content, some essential content that is associated with the knowledge of the existence of that thing. So I know that to be a human or a dog or some other thing, and that is the knowledge of a nature, of an essence. But the soul's habitual self-knowledge is the sheer fact of knowing that I exist. The formulation that Aquinas usually chooses is, in as much as the soul has being in that individual. So secundum cum ade quod habet esse in tal individuo. So it's a very existential, experiential knowledge that I exist. I am in being, sort of kind of knowledge, and it's not. And he very carefully and sort of constantly distinguishes it from a kind of quantitative or essential knowledge that the soul can have of itself, because that requires not sort of just knowing that I exist, but sort of turning actively to my soul as an object of intellections and seeing what is this thing that I am. So they're very two separate knowledge, distinct knowledge. but the knowledge, the kind of existential experiential knowledge is always present in the knowledge of some other thing, but not thematically. Sort of, I'm considering it. It's sort of objectifying it.
So as you're reading it, this I that I know to exist in this habitual way is something that I can then turn around and ask,
Yes.
in the manner of Descartes, what it is.
Yes.
And,
If you're, if I can jump in, which I can. If you're stripping it of all this essential content, why doesn't this become like an ich denke that accompanies
so right,
all?
so that's where I wanted this to go.
I don't know if it
Because it's also the base. Isn't this also the basis for what they knew later? You later use that to have the science of the soul.
Yes.
So if it's this merely like an ich denke, then it seems like a very difficult to make the basis of the science.
Well,
of the soul.
it is an existential knowledge, sort of, or experiential knowledge in that sense. But the way that it takes place, and this is why Aquinas follows Aristotle very clearly, is that it takes place per speciem. So the soul sees itself per essentiam, which is the title of the paper. So the soul sees itself by its essence, but sort of that knowledge is actualized in every single knowledge of every other thing by means of a species. And by knowing through a species some other thing, I also become aware of myself sort of in act, in a sense. I could become aware of myself. And the knowledge of that other thing sort of informs me about what I am in a sense as well. So I have the knowledge of that I am, and I have the knowledge that I'm capable of knowing cats. And that tells me something vaguely, implicitly, obscurely, however that is, but it tells me something about myself. But it always happens in the knowledge of some other thing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, we're moving right along here. Just this.
Can we get hands on
Yeah,
This
yeah,
would be enough, more than enough. And then stand up here at the
So our next speaker, in case you've missed him, is Father Raphael. Also, thank you. Also another proud product of Notre Dame, and also probably, our West Coast Dominican representative for our conference. And he will be talking about psychological continuity without personhood, Aquinas on the separated soul.
Yeah, there's actually one other West Coast Dominican who's speaking as well, Brother Nathaniel. All right, so John Locke asks us to imagine a situation where the conscious awareness of a prince and a cobbler is exchanged. The cobbler wakes up to find himself in the body of the prince, and the prince wakes up to find himself in the body of the cobbler. And the way I've described the imagined scenario already suggests the conclusion that Locke thinks we should draw from it, namely that after the exchange of conscious awareness, it is the very person of the cobbler that wakes up in the prince's body, and it is the person of the prince that wakes up in the cobbler's body. The person then who appears to the world with the body of a prince after the exchange is numerically identical to the person who, before the exchange, appeared to the world in the body of the cobbler. However, the man, the human substance that was, or perhaps that housed, the person of the prince before the switch, is still, according to Locke, the same human substance after the switch as before. Thus, Locke's thought experiment suggests that the concept of a person is not essentially bound up with substance. In this, he goes beyond Descartes, in that conceivably even the soul of the cobbler, understood as a Cartesian thinking substance, might remain in the cobbler's original body when their conscious awareness gets swapped. Hence, what is essential to the person is not that it is a thinking thing, for if Locke is right, the thing can come apart from the thinking, such that the diachronic identity conditions for a person are purely psychological. The cobbler's Cartesian soul stays in his body, while the cobbler's center of consciousness migrates into the prince's body/soul composite, such that the person who lives in the prince's palace truly is the person who formerly made and mended shoes. Now, much could be and has been said about Locke's view, but I'm not here to talk about Locke's view. What I want to highlight is that Locke's central intuition about personhood is widely shared today among philosophers and non-philosophers alike. it is very hard for us to deny that Locke's imagined scenario is correctly described as the cobbler waking up in the prince's body and the prince waking up in the cobbler's body. Granted, there are a few ways in which a Thomist, or someone broadly sympathetic with Aquinas' Aristotelianism, might want to push back against this account of personhood. For instance, one might want to draw the distinction between different kinds of conscious awareness, such as that which is associated with the senses and that which is associated with the intellect. We can then distinguish rational consciousness from non-rational consciousness, and we may want to limit our concept of personhood to rational consciousness, or at least to beings that have the potency for rational consciousness. Thus, a human infant would be a person because of its as yet unactualized potency for rational consciousness, whereas an adult dog would not be a person since it lacks such a potency, despite its having senses, imagination, emotions, etc. Thus, we can qualify a broadly Lockean account by tying personhood specifically to rational consciousness, and not consciousness as such. Further, we might want to say that rational consciousness is not strictly necessary for personhood, nor is continuity of rational consciousness necessary for continuity of personhood. For a Thomist might want to say that even a human being who seems definitively to have lost consciousness has not thereby ceased to be a person, since there is still living human substance, and indeed the same living human substance. Similarly, a Thomist might say that someone with radical memory loss, or someone in whom non-veridical memories of the past have been implanted, is nevertheless the same person he always was, despite having lost continuity of consciousness. And so, someone sympathetic with Aquinas will probably want to qualify any concept of personhood that links it closely with consciousness, by on the one hand limiting the connection between consciousness and personhood to rational consciousness, and on the other hand saying that rational consciousness is not strictly necessary for personhood. Be that as it may, I want to suggest that hardly anyone these days, even an Aristotelian Thomist, will easily abandon the intuition that rational conscious awareness is sufficient for personhood, and that continuity of rational conscious awareness is sufficient for continuity of personhood. Consciousness, at least rational consciousness, tends to be for us modern people the distinctive feature of what a person is, even if there are cases where we want to affirm personhood in its absence. We are not inclined to deny personhood to something that hasn't. And this is where our modern concept of personhood, one that is, to some degree, shared by, I think, nearly all of us, is in deep tension with Aquinas' concept of personhood. For it is pretty clear that Aquinas would acknowledge there is continuity of rational awareness, rational consciousness, between the living human substance and the post-mortem separated soul. Yet he denies that the separated soul is a person. Hence, Aquinas would reject both the claim that rational consciousness is sufficient for personhood and that continuity of rational consciousness is sufficient for continuity of personhood. And as I have suggested, we, that is, we modern people, find both of these claims at least highly intuitive, if not self-evident. My purpose in this talk is to suggest that first, this conceptual tension between us and Aquinas exists. And second, that it is deeply relevant both for correctly interpreting Aquinas' thought on human nature and for determining whether or to what extent it is true. I want to begin by saying something briefly about the claim that there is continuity of rational consciousness between the living human substance and the separated soul, according to Aquinas. Now, I think this claim is rather uncontroversial, so I won't dwell on it. The first two texts on the handout are meant to deal with what I take to be one possible objection to such continuity, which has to do with the significant difference in the soul's mode of understanding in a separate state, as compared to its mode of understanding in the body. Nevertheless, the soul itself is still the same subsistent entity that was once united to the body, and its power of understanding, too, is the very same individual power that acted during life, which is what Aquinas asserts in the response to objection 8 there, in that first set of texts. Given the identity of the soul and its powers across the boundary of death, I think it is very hard to deny that for Aquinas, there's going to be continuity in intellectual consciousness and understanding between the life of the human person and the conscious life of the person's separated soul, even though the way in which the soul understands is quite different. Yet, despite this continuity of consciousness, Aquinas famously denies that the separated soul is a person. He does this because he follows Boethius in defining a person as an individual substance of a rational nature. According to Aquinas' understanding, this is the true definition. This is a true definition in that both the criteria it gives for personhood are essentially and absolutely necessary for something to be a person. In particular, Aquinas interprets Boethius' definition as entailing that the individual substance of a rational nature must also be a complete substance. It must be complete in a species. And it is precisely because the soul, including the separated soul, is by its essence only a part of a complete species that it fails the completeness criterion. And he says this very straightforwardly in the sed contra of the passage from the sentences that I quote there. A person has the ratio of complete and whole, but the soul is a part. Therefore, the soul does not have the ratio of a person. And you can find that sort of argument all throughout his corpus. Now, this denial of personhood to the separated soul has been known to make Aquinas' commentators uncomfortable. The intuition that rational consciousness experience is the distinctive mark of personhood is deeply ingrained in us. It may be in part due to this discomfort that some authors go to great lengths to emphasize the similarity between the separated soul and a person, suggesting in various ways that Aquinas thinks the soul is, as it were, almost a person. The soul is claimed to be personal or person-like, an incomplete person, or semi-person. The general thought seems to be that it is kind of only on a technicality that the separated soul fails Aquinas' test for personhood. But really, the soul has all the important features of a person, and those important features are the psychological ones that we modern people value. Behind this thought is the idea that of the two criteria for personhood that Aquinas enumerates, the more important one, the one that makes the soul positively person-like, is rationality or intellectuality, whereas the completeness criterion is at best secondary. But does this reflect Aquinas' own understanding of personhood? I think it does not. In fact, I think we should be suspicious about the tendency to minimize the importance of the completeness criterion for personhood. Suspicious that we are reading Aquinas through the lens of our own post-Lockean intuitions about what a person is. Consider the text from the sentences commentary from the corpus there, at the bottom of the front side of your handout. So this is my translation. It must be said that concerning the union of soul to body, among the ancients there were two views. One, that the soul is united to the body as a complete being to a complete being, as though it were in the body as a sailor in a ship. And he goes on to explain the Platonic view. But the view of Aristotle is otherwise, which all modern thinkers follow, modern meaning his time, that the soul is united to the body as form to matter, whence the soul is a part of human nature and not a certain nature in itself. And since the ratio of a part is opposed to the ratio of a person, as has been said, the separated soul cannot therefore be a person. For although being separated, it is not actually a part. Nevertheless, it has such a nature so as to be a part. Now, we could perhaps interpret this as simply indicating that in order for X to be a person, X must be a part. But it seems to be saying something a bit stronger than that. Namely, the very idea of parthood, the ratio of parthood, is incompatible with the idea of personhood. This suggests, and he says it's contrary to the ratio of a person. And this suggests that by Aquinas' lights, the separate soul does not fall short of personhood on a mere technicality. Rather, it has a nature that is fundamentally incompatible with the very ratio of personhood. Moreover, on several occasions, Aquinas compares the human soul to bodily parts, often using a hand as his example, in order to illustrate his point that a part cannot be a person. Consider the next text on the back of the handout. So this is a response to an objection. It must be said that the soul is a part of the human species, and so although it may be separated, yet since it retains the nature of unability, it cannot be called an individual substance, which is the hypostasis or first substance, just as neither can the hand nor any of the parts of man. And in this way, neither the definition nor the name of person belongs to it. So, Aquinas' repeated comparison of the human soul to bodily parts tends to puzzle modern commentators for a variety of reasons. But set that aside for a moment. On a straightforward reading, Aquinas' argument here goes something like this. The soul is a part of a rational substance, not a rational substance itself. Likewise, a human hand is a part of a rational substance, not a rational substance itself. But no one would think a hand is a person. Therefore, neither should we think that the soul is a person. What's striking is that Aquinas makes the point by comparing the soul to another part, a part that does not even have an intellectual power. Thus, a post-Lockean thinker might justly respond that this is an unhelpful comparison because a hand is not person-like in any way. Thus, if our intuition is that the human soul is almost a person, this is a terrible argument. But Aquinas doesn't usually make terrible arguments. Moreover, he makes this argument, or one very much like it, over and over throughout his corpus. And so I think a more charitable interpretation is that Aquinas just has different intuitions about what a person is than we do. In particular, for him, the fact that the soul has intellectual powers does not make it very person-like at all. Because in his mind, the completeness condition is every bit as important for the concept of personhood as the rationality condition. Hence, Aquinas sees the hand and the soul as more alike than different with respect to personhood. Both are parts of a rational substance. And since the ratio of parthood is positively opposed to the ratio of personhood, neither of them is very much like a person. In short, the psychological features of the separated human soul do not impress Aquinas. When it comes to the question of personhood, in the way that they impress us. Although he recognizes that some who skew towards the Platonic anthropology might think the soul is very much like a person, Aquinas simply doesn't. And this is because he is intuitively thinking of personhood along Boethian lines. Whereas in contrast, our modern concept of person puts much more emphasis on the psychological. And this is true even for those of us who are sympathetic with Aquinas' anthropology and not with Locke's or Descartes'. As modern persons, our intuitions about personhood just tend to be different from Aquinas'. And so likewise, our intuitions about whether the separated soul is person-like also are different. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with what I take to be the most important question. What is the correct concept of personhood? To use a rather overused metaphor, you might say, which concept of personhood cuts reality more closely at the joints? Now, I don't have a settled view on the answer to that question. However, by way of conclusion, I want to respond to what I take to be a tempting objection to Aquinas' Boethian view of personhood. So the objection goes something like this. Look, consciousness and the first-person perspective of the subject is not a theme in Aquinas. He didn't consider it because it hadn't been explored by thinkers in his time in the way that it has been explored in the modern era. So it isn't something he took particularly seriously or based his arguments on. This, so the argument goes, is a lacuna in his thought, one that needs filling because the first-person conscious perspective is important for philosophical anthropology. It gives us real insight into who we are. Hence, Aquinas' concept of personhood ought to be enhanced by our modern sensitivity to subjective experience, since it was something Aquinas did not seriously reflect upon. Incidentally, I suspect that John Paul II held a view something like this. Aquinas' philosophical anthropology is very much still relevant, but needs to be updated and augmented by insights from the modern conception of personhood. Now, I don't think this view is entirely mistaken. It is clearly true that Aquinas does not treat consciousness as a theme, and it is also true that it plays a far smaller role in his anthropological thought than it does in our minds today. And it might be that that is a shortcoming. However, it would be a mistake to overlook the important role that first-person experience does play from time to time in Aquinas' thought. One of the most striking examples of this can be found in question 76 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, where he argues that the part of us through which our intellectual powers operate is a form. Take a look at the last text there in your handout. Aquinas says, but if someone says that the intellective soul is not the form of the body, they must find a way to explain how understanding can be the action of this man. For each one experiences that it is he himself who understands. But an action is attributed to someone in three ways, etc. And the first indeed cannot stand, as has been shown, because it is the very same man who perceives himself both to understand and to sense. The same man perceives himself to understand and to sense. But sensation cannot occur without a body. Whence the body must be a part of the human being. It follows then that the intellect by which Socrates understands is also a part of Socrates, such that the intellect is in some way united to the body of Socrates. So the cornerstone of this argument is a first-person subjective experience that Aquinas thinks all of us have. It is the experience that both the action of sensing and the action of understanding is mine. It is I myself who sense and I myself who understand. Both of these operations are operations of one single substance. And this, Aquinas seems to think, is an undeniable datum of subjective experience that we all share. This appeal to conscious experience is crucially important for Aquinas' anthropology and for his argument for that anthropology, since it's the way that he excludes the views of, like those of Avicenna and Averroes, that he claims entail that it is not really the individual human substance that is the true subject of understanding, since they outsource parts of our understanding to separate substances. So what does this show? Well, it shows that Aquinas does give an indispensable role to subjective conscious experience in his philosophy of human nature, and it at least qualifies the claim that Aquinas' thought does not take conscious experience seriously as a philosophical datum. Of course, this doesn't at all show that Aquinas' concept of personhood does not need updating. However, it at least calls into question whether and to what degree it does. And this has great implications, for if, and I mean only if, it turns out that Aquinas' concept of personhood already adequately takes into account first-person experience, well, that would call into question whether the modern emphasis on such experience is, on the whole, leading us towards or away from a true understanding of what a person is. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes for questions, in which I hope we hear more about the cobbler formerly known as Prince.
I mean, in contemporary philosophy and in modern philosophy, the concept person is supposed to do this really important work, right? It's supposed to be like a locus of moral value and a locus of moral responsibility and so on.
Yeah.
And the concept person, as I understand it in Aquinas, is doing no such work. Like he doesn't, put another way, in contemporary philosophy, and philosophy since Locke, we're supposed to be able to say, like, these are the persons over here, and these are the persons over here. So it's a kind term. And it also gives us a sortal term. We're like, there's this thing and this thing. And are they the same? Well, there's one question. Are they the same body? Are they the same human being? And there's another question. Are they the same person?
Yeah.
And person isn't doing that kind of work in Aquinas. Aquinas wouldn't be happy saying that I'm both a human being and a person. I mean, you can say that I'm a person, but that's a kind of secondary, like, I mean, there's another way of putting
A human being and a person are different concepts. I think you could say that I'm both a human being and a person.
I mean, you could, but you're saying
It
different
follows
things
from
when you say
rationality,
those two
yeah.
things are. When you say those two things, right? Because one of them is saying something about the kind of thing I am, it gives the conditions for the existence of this thing over time and so on. And the second one does no such thing. The second one, to say that I'm a person, really just says something about what it is to be a human being. Right? Whereas I think for the modern tradition, the tradition that comes from Locke, to say that something is a person is to say something that's on its own significant. It is a way of carving the person things from the non-person things. And then to say that something's a person then raises the question whether it's the same person and so on and so forth. And I just don't see the concept doing that kind of work and so one suggestion is, and I think waiting for this to be sympathetic to your argument, we should stop letting person do that kind of philosophical work at all. Whereas I think you're right that the tradition that we get after JP2 invites us to make person central in just the way that the modern tradition does.
Yeah, I mean, that could be one takeaway. And another takeaway could be that, like, we have an equivocation going on here, really. That like, you have person one and person two. And, I mean, the connection between them is in some ways tenuous. Or you could argue that it's tenuous if you're arguing from the perspective of how much work it's doing throughout, other parts of philosophy.
Yes.
I guess I think that's a really good point. I guess I kind of broadened that my shot at the end, right? But my main the main thing I'm targeting is this idea that I don't think people should be so surprised that Aquinas thinks separate. Its soul is not a person. Like, I think it just follows. I don't think it's a radical position.
It's not a human being.
That he takes. There's a different concept going on there, but I do think there is still a question of, like, there is something common to our modern conception of personhood and his. Like, they're continuous with each other, and we have this idea of, I mean, of course, for Aquinas and for Boethius, right, it comes from the understanding of Trinity.
That's
so
right.
in some ways, that's backwards from Aristotelian understanding of the thing we best know first. It's a really interesting point to have to think about more.
Stephen Hazard is a finger.
Stephen Hazard is a finger.
Yeah, I was just gonna say something similar to John and just point out that it doesn't seem like there's actually a disagreement so much about personhood here as it is about the concept of a human being. Because that's really what's central to Aquinas' argument. Like, that's what's getting him this stuff about the completeness criterion, right? Because he's got the Boethian definition of a person, which doesn't like actually make his case on its own. He has to pull in the stuff about substance, and what kind of substance is it? Well, it's a substance of this kind of nature, and that's what leads him to say, well, this isn't, it can't be a person because it's not a human being in the human
Because
species.
it's not complete. Yeah.
So I think the debate is really more about like John is saying, the connection of personhood with what it takes to be a human being. Maybe not so much like we've got these two radically different conceptions of personhood, and now we have to like figure out which one is true. It's really more about like, well, is personhood inextricably tied to natures in this kind of way that Aquinas thinks that they are?
Yeah, so which is a little bit a different question, the question of what a human being is, right? Because I think for Aquinas, it's clearly what a human being is what's towing the cart.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not. It doesn't decide ahead of time what a person is. And,
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
But so although there might be disagreements with various modern points of view, I mean, we don't disagree with Aquinas on what a human person is, on what a human being is. But I take it that the second part of your point was to put it a little bit differently, which is that I'm losing track of it.
Well, there might be a way of gaining some traction in the debate if you think of it as a debate between modern conceptions and Aquinas' conception of personhood. There might be ways of gaining some traction if you say, well, you guys over here, the moderns, do you think of human beings in the same way as Aquinas does?
Yeah.
And if you do, then that should push you to this kind of conception about person.
Yeah, but you see, I think it doesn't. It doesn't push you there because I'm really not talking to people outside the Thomistic tradition with this talk. I mean, my point is that I too feel the pull that, like, conscious awareness is really important to personhood, more than Aquinas makes it, but I guess I'm trying to acknowledge that he doesn't agree. At least it doesn't seem like his intuitions go the same direction, because he has a different concept of personhood. Maybe certainly the concept is different, but the question is what what to do about it. Whether we should stop using. See, I think stopping using personhood for like ethical things and stuff like that is downstream of the concept of personhood itself. And ultimately, I think we have to first figure out what we mean by person, or what we should mean by person, before we can decide what to put to use in those ways. I'm not saying people may reason topsy-turvy sometimes too. Yeah, no, thank you.
I'm not sure if I add anything useful to this conversation, but I will say it anyway. So far, the discussion on personhood has evolved around self-consciousness and things like that, right? But there's another aspect attached to personhood which has to do with being relational as something that is constitutive of who you are. And I'm not sure if that in any way helps to make
Yeah.
to shape the discussion in a different way that might be more fruitful. I don't know. I'm just throwing this here.
Yeah, well, I think that that aspect of personhood is much more emphasized in the modern context, and I think that gets thrown into the bin of things that have to be evaluated. Is to what extent should we understand the person as related? I mean, human beings live in relationship with each other, right? That's clear, but so do separated souls, right? In a different way. So how does that play into this? I'm not sure, but I do associate it more with a modern conception.
Because I was tying it with actually Trinitarian theology, really, right? So
With what?
Trinitarian
theology, yeah.
So I mean, that was my kind of
Yeah.
point of departure, right? So not so much
Yeah.
what modern conversation is about.
Yeah, we have to be careful with that too, though, because like the relations define the persons in that case, and that's not the case for us, because we each have our own individual substance. Yeah.
I think we should cut it because we have
Okay.
a little bit of time. There's a lot of bleak, but thank you.
Let me just say one thing. I am a little suspicious of the Boethian definition for precisely the reason that it seems to come from the Trinity down, which is the wrong way of, which is epistemologically an unsafe way of arguing.
Not first.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have a handout? I do. Are you handing it?
I'd also like to stand up here at the podium if I may.
Okay. So our final speaker is Jeremy Skrzypek, is assistant professor of philosophy at Ohio Dominican. He received his PhD in philosophy from St. Louis in 2016. He works in metaphysics, medieval philosophy, philosophy of religion, focusing especially on the Aristotelian theory of hylomorphism and the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And he will be presenting today. His paper is called Bundle Up or Lay Low, Thomas Aquinas on Concrete Particulars.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. In this presentation, I'm going to offer some brief thoughts on several interrelated topics. St. Thomas Aquinas' views on material substances, accidental forms, and accidental unities, contemporary theories of concrete particulars, which is sort of contemporary theories about sort of substances and substance-like things, and Aquinas' place among these contemporary theories. My focus here will be on Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of material substances as a contemporary theory of concrete particulars, sort of inserting him into the contemporary debate to see where he fits in there and whether he offers some interesting insights. While I will be highlighting some key interpretive disagreements between scholars of Aquinas, I won't be doing any of the actual interpretive work here. The goal of the paper is twofold: to try to better determine where Aquinas' views fit within contemporary debates on concrete particulars, and to try to argue that there are some potential problems for one common way of interpreting Aquinas' views once we transfer that interpretation into the contemporary debate. So it's mostly Aquinas sort of as a contemporary theorist on this debate about concrete particulars. I have some other papers where I sort of go deep into the text to try to figure out sort of interpretively where should we put him in here. And so what I'm sort of thinking about, what I'm puzzling through is, well, let's say, right, there are at least two big ways of interpreting Aquinas on his hylomorphic theory of material substances. I'll explain sort of the difference between these two models that I'm calling them. You have some nice colored pictures in the diagram if you got one of the colored diagrams. I'll explain the difference in these two ways of interpreting Aquinas, but I'm less interested in this presentation on the interpretive task of figuring out which diagram better maps his view. I'm just saying, well, these two models, let's think of them as sort of like contemporary theories of concrete particulars, and let's see, right, setting aside sort of the interpretive sort of motivations, which one should we sort of like want to be Aquinas' view if we want him to have the right one, something like that. So let's begin with a map of the contemporary debate on concrete particulars. So in the contemporary debate on concrete particulars, a constituent ontology is any theory of concrete particulars that says that properties or forms exist within the objects that possess them, and the objects that possess them do so by including those properties or forms among their metaphysical parts or constituents. In contrast, a relational ontology is any theory of concrete particulars that says that properties or forms exist outside of the objects that possess them, and the objects that possess them do so by being related via exemplification or instantiation or even adherence to something outside of themselves. There are two main varieties of constituent ontologies: bundle theories and substratum theories. Bundle theory says that concrete particulars are composed of nothing more than their properties. Substratum theory says that concrete particulars are composed of their properties as well as an underlying substratum in which those properties inhere. And there are different views about what that substratum is, whether it's a bare particular or whether it's something else. It seems pretty clear to me that Thomas Aquinas is at least some kind of constituent ontologist. According to Aquinas, material substances are best understood as composed of form and matter are in turn best understood as metaphysical parts or constituents of material substances. Right? As we already saw from Father Raphael's talk, right, that he uses the language of pars and totem, right, to describe the relationship, especially between sort of soul and body and the human being composed of both. So I'm not sort of, that's not doing violence to his work yet. Not yet, right? We'll see whether I do violence to Aquinas' view later on, but not yet. No violence yet. Okay. So where exactly does Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of material substances fall within the contemporary debate then? Is Aquinas a bundle theorist, or is he closer to a bundle theorist, or is he a kind of substratum theorist? Is he closer to sort of kind of a substratum theory? Is his a pure constituent ontology at all, or are there elements of a relational ontology in it? Even though I think it's clear that he's sort of predominantly or primarily a constituent ontologist, are there also elements of a relational ontology? And as it turns out, there are two main models for understanding Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of material substances. The two models diverge on the placement and the mode of possession of accidental forms. According to what I will call the simple model, material substances are composed of prime matter and substantial form and possess their accidental forms by serving as the substratum in which they inhere. On this model, for every accidental form possessed by a material substance, there is some further accidental unity composed of just that accident and the material substance in which that accident inheres. For example, the accidental unity pale Socrates consists of Socrates and his accidental form of paleness and exists only as long as that accidental form inheres in Socrates. So proponents of this sort of model that I'm calling the simple model include folks like Jeff Brower, Robert Pasnow, David Oderberg, Chris Brown are in this camp. According to what I'll call the expanded model, so this is sort of the competition, so one of the things I've been trying to uncover is that there is this debate going on what to do with accidents, whether they're inside as parts or external as sort of like attachments from the outside, and I'm trying to sort of sort this out, lay out the terrain. Here's this really interesting debate that I think not everyone is sort of appreciating. This is a big sort of substantive debate that you guys are having. Okay, so what about the other view, the other main model? And it doesn't mean that these are the only two, but these are sort of like the two main ones that I see. So according to what I'll call the expanded model, material substances are composed of prime matter, substantial form, and each of their accidental forms, and so possess their accidental forms by having them among their metaphysical parts or constituents. On this model, a material substance possesses both essential metaphysical parts, its prime matter and substantial form, and accidental metaphysical parts, the various accidental forms that it possesses over the course of its existence. Where the essential parts compose the core or the nucleus of the substance, its essence or nature, and the accidental forms surround that core, and I'm imagining, right, I'm sort of like trying to fill out the model, imagining the accidental forms kind of surround that core in concentric circles, their proximity to the core determined by their relative importance to the identity of the substance. So to place accidents as parts doesn't mean that they're sort of as core as sort of like the substantial form of prime matter. It also doesn't mean that all accidental forms are sort of like have the same degree of importance for the identity of the substance. So I'm imagining sort of concentric circles, right? So you've got like the proper accidents, the right outside the core, and then you've got sort of like the non-separable accidents right out that. Then you go way out here, right, until you sort of like the really sort of like on the periphery accidents, right? Sort of like the particular outfit I'm wearing, right, or particular location of the hairs on my head or something like that. Oh, okay. All right. So on this model, a material. Okay. According to the simple model, Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of material substances is a kind of substratum theory. Indeed, it's actually a two-tiered substratum theory. There are two sort of layers of substrata. Though it also contains elements of a relational ontology. For in this model, accidental forms are external to the material substances that possess them. Material substances possess such forms by serving as the substratum in which they inhere. According to the expanded model, Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of material substances is a kind of substratum theory in that prime matter serves as the ultimate substratum for all of the material substances forms, but it also shares certain similarities with certain varieties of bundle theory, especially so-called nuclear bundle theory, championed by Peter Simons, and eschews any elements of a relational ontology. For in this model, accidental forms are internal to the material substances that possess them. Material substances possess all of their forms by including them among their metaphysical parts or constituents. So that's sort of laying the terrain. It's two ways of interpreting Aquinas. They sort of have, and I'm sort of sketching out the pictures of the different models. They disagree mostly on where the accidental forms go, and it's going to place Aquinas in different views or different place on the spectrum in contemporary theories of concrete particulars. So we've got their sort of basic understanding of the model, where that would place Aquinas in the contemporary debate on concrete particulars. Now I'm going to try to argue that for sort of like as a theory of concrete particulars, there are some reasons to prefer the expanded model over the simple model. Okay, so as a contemporary theory of concrete particulars, I see two potential problems for the simple model. The first major concern is called the problem of extrinsicality, and I'm basing both of these problems by problems that are sort of well rehearsed in the literature on theories of concrete particulars, and so what I'm doing is applying them. If this is Aquinas' view, then he's going to be susceptible to these sort of other problems that are being discussed in theories of concrete particulars. So what's the problem of extrinsicality? So here's generally how the problem is pitched for other relational ontologies. So according to relational ontologies, properties exist outside of the objects that possess them, and the objects that possess them do so by being related in some way to something outside of themselves. What follows from this is that objects possess each of their properties extrinsically. An object is a certain way or has a certain character, not by virtue of itself or anything within itself, but by virtue of how something else is and how the object is related to that thing. For pure relational ontologies, this means that objects possess no intrinsic features whatsoever. There is no way that an object is in itself on its own, separate from its relation to other things. On the simple model of Aquinas' ontology, because it's not a pure relational ontology, it's only got some elements of it, material substances are not completely lacking in intrinsic features. Material substances possess their substantial forms intrinsically, and indeed their prime matter. So any material substance is of a certain essential kind and has a certain essential nature intrinsically. However, here's an interesting sort of complication of the simple model. On the simple model, it is still the case that material substances possess no intrinsic accidental features. So, for example, on the simple model, while it is true that a human being is intrinsically human by virtue of possessing a distinctively human substantial form as one of its metaphysical parts or constituents, a human being is only extrinsically a certain size, shape, and color. This is especially problematic as an interpretation of Aquinas, because Aquinas holds that material substances are at least in part individuated by their accidents, though the story here is quite complicated. And so it will follow on the simple model that for individual human beings, the fact that they are particular human beings and that they are the particular human beings that they are is an extrinsic fact about them. They are particulars, and they are the particulars that they are not in themselves or on their own or separate from their relations to other things, but by virtue of things outside of themselves in their relations to those things. To put it in another way, on the simple model, human beings turn out to be not only intrinsically very similar to one another, but intrinsically identical. There is no intrinsic difference between one human being and another. Notice that this is not a problem faced by the expanded model. For on that model, material substances possess each of their properties or forms, both their substantial forms and their accidental forms, as metaphysical parts or constituents. As a result, in the expanded model, material substances possess each of their properties or forms intrinsically, assuming that to have something as a part is to possess it intrinsically. A human being is a certain color, size, and shape, is a certain kind of person, and is a particular instance of the kind human being by virtue of something within itself. And that is a count in favor of the expanded model. So that's the first major concern. The second major concern is the problem of too many possessors. According to substratum theories, every property of a concrete particular bears a relation to two different things. the concrete particular of which it is a metaphysical part or constituent, and the substratum in which it inheres. Now, if inherence and constituency are both ways of possessing and thus being characterized by a property, then for every property possessed by some concrete particular, there are actually two things that possess and are thus characterized by that property, the concrete particular and its substratum. For example, for every apple that possesses the property of being red, there are actually two red things there. There's the apple and its substratum. And for every human being that possesses the property of being human, there are actually two human things there, the human being and its substratum. But that seems like too many red things, too many humans. We want just one human in your chair. That's enough. Now, substratum theorists can get around this worry by denying that inherence is a way of possessing and thus being characterized by a property. So if inherence in both, the problem is that if inherence and constituency are both ways of possessing and being characterized by a property. So you can get around the worry by denying that one of them is a way to possess a property or to be characterized by it. So you can deny that inherence is a way of possessing and thus being characterized by a property. For in that case, only the concrete particular and not its substratum will possess and thus be characterized by the relevant property. But for the simple model, this response is unavailable. For according to the simple model, there are and must be two ways to possess accidental forms or properties. Along the lines of a constituent ontology, an accidental unity possesses its accidental form by constituency, by having that accidental form as one of its metaphysical parts. So pale Socrates is pale. And along the lines of a relational ontology, a material substance possesses its accidental form by inherence, by serving as the substratum which that accidental form inheres. So pale Socrates, so Socrates is also pale. So Socrates and pale Socrates are both pale. To deny that inherence is a way of possessing and thus being characterized by a property would be to deny that material substances possess and are thus characterized by their accidental forms. It would be to say that, strictly speaking, material substances possess no accidental features or properties whatsoever, not intrinsically, not extrinsically, not in any way. Material substances would bear certain relations to other things which possess various accidental features. They would be part of the accidental unities which bear or possess those properties, but they would not possess any of those features themselves. And that seems like the wrong result. So it seems like proponents of the simple model should say that for any accidental form or property possessed by a material substance, there are indeed two things that possess that property: the material substance in which that accidental form inheres, and the accidental unity of which it is a metaphysical part or constituent. And so it looks like the simple model faces a too many possessors problem. Notice once again that this is not a problem faced by the expanded model. For in the expanded model, there is just one way to possess and thus be characterized by a property, by constituency. A material substance possesses both the substantial form and its accidental forms by having them among their metaphysical parts or constituents. And once again, it doesn't mean that those are the constituents in the same way or sort of like the same degree or they're in the same location within the interior structure of the substance, but they're both owned by constituency, and so it's both sort of, there's one simple analysis for how it owns or possesses or is characterized by both the types of forms that it possesses. On this model, substantial forms inhere in prime matter, and accidental forms inhere in essences or natures, understanding the essence or nature of a material substance to consist of its prime matter, or more precisely its common matter, and its substantial form. But here inherence is not to be understood as a mode of property possession. So proponents of the expanded model can sometimes talk about inherence, but it isn't going to be understood as that's a way of owning the property. Here, inherence will merely be a mode of placement, a way of specifying the internal structure of material substances. Right? On the expanded model, to say the accidental form inheres in the substance, or inheres sort of with respect to any of sort of the other sort of parts within the substance, it's just supposed to sort of identify its location within the internal structure of that substance, you know, like the leg bone is connected to the hip bone, that sort of thing. That's all inherence means on the expanded model. Importantly, the expanded model need not be committed to the claim that inherence is a mode of property possession. It's just sort of a locational notion. For unlike the simple model, it can account for all required instances of property possession in terms of constituency. And because the expanded model avoids both of these concerns for the simple model, that gives us two good reasons to prefer that model as a contemporary theory of concrete particulars. That's like holding all the interpretive claims, sort of like if there's a stalemate in terms of like what Aquinas' texts actually say, here's like some contemporary reasons to hope that he's sort of like that his view is actually sort of the expanded model. It would be better for all of us, right? If he were a proponent of the expanded model. That's what I'm sort of trying to push, is sort of like there are sort of like these counterintuitive implications of the simple model, which I've argued, aren't counterintuitive implications of the expanded model. Okay, how am I doing on time?
I have about 4 minutes left.
Okay. Well, I'll talk a little bit about I'll respond to then sort of like I've sketched out the distinction between the models. I've violently inserted Aquinas into contemporary debate on concrete particulars, right? And then I've talked about some reasons to prefer the expanded model. And a few of the minutes I have left, I'll talk about a little bit of a few responses that I've received to these arguments, and some of which I think I have a good answer to, some of which I'm not sure, and so I'll be interested in your thoughts. Okay. So here's the first rejoinder. The extrinsicality objection operates on an understanding of intrinsic, according to which only that which is included or contained within a thing is intrinsic to it. On that understanding, any of the accidental forms of material substance on the simple model are indeed extrinsic. But there's another way of understanding intrinsic, according to which anything that is caused or produced by the internal principles of a thing are intrinsic. And indeed, I'm interested if there are other sort of understandings of intrinsic, which is going to avoid the worry that I pitched for the simple model. And on that understanding, on the intrinsic as produced or caused by the internal principles of a thing, some of the accidents of a material substance would indeed count as intrinsic on the simple model. So that's going to help a little bit, but I'm not sure that it's going to count for all of them. Maybe even sort of like on that account, you could only say that the proper accidents would be caused or produced by the internal principles of a thing. Some of the other accidents are still sort of going to be they're going to come from the outside, they're going to remain on the outside on the simple view, and so a lot of those accidents are still going to count as extrinsic. Okay. Here's a second rejoinder. Here's another sort of reply I've received. So while on Aquinas' account of material individuation, certain accidents falling under the category of quantity do play a role in the individuation of material substances, the role that they play has been mischaracterized. This is the objection. These accidents individuate the material substance to which they belong, not simply by inhering in them from the outside, but by reaching in and individuating the very matter of which the substance is composed, which matter is, even on the simple model, a metaphysical part or constituent of that substance. And so properly understood, Aquinas' account of material individuation does not have the result that on the simple model, material substances belonging to a common species are intrinsically identical. They will be numerically distinct by virtue of the numerically distinctness of their matter, which as a metaphysical part or constituent is intrinsic to them. I think that's a nice sort of reply. Here's my response to the objection. First, because the matter of which a material substance is composed is individualized by something outside of that substance, there's still a sense in which on the simple model, a material substance owes its individuality to something outside of itself. And so in that sense, material substances of the same species are still extrinsically numerically distinct from one another. Second, even if it turned out that on the simple model, two material substances of the same species are intrinsically numerically distinct, it is still going to be the case that they are intrinsically qualitatively identical. Unless we want to say that other accidents reach in and permanently alter the matter or form of a material substance, it will still be the case that any particular material substance is the size, color, shape it is, thinks the particular thoughts that it thinks, and performs the particular actions that it does, only by virtue of things that are strictly speaking outside of it. And that these accidental features turn out to be extrinsic facts about material substance strikes me as the wrong result. I have a couple other objections that are featured both in the handout and here. We're about to jump to the conclusion, and we can talk about the other ones on the handout if you think those are good ones that I shouldn't have jumped over. Okay. So to sum up everything that I've tried to discuss in the paper, I've distinguished between two competing models for how to understand Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of material substances, which diverge on the placement and the mode of possession of accidental forms. According to the simple model, material substances are composed of prime matter and substantial form, and possess their accidental forms by serving as the substratum in which they inhere. According to the expanded model, material substances are composed of prime matter, substantial form, and each of their accidental forms, and so possess their accidental forms by having them among their metaphysical parts or constituents. With respect to the contemporary debate on concrete particulars, on the simple model, Aquinas' theory is a kind of substratum theory, though it also contains elements of a relational ontology. And on the expanded model, Aquinas' theory remains a kind of substratum theory, but also has some similarities with certain varieties of bundle theory and eschews any elements of relational ontology. I've argued that the expanded model is the preferable model, all the interpretive issues sort of being equal, due to the fact that it successfully avoids two major worries for the simple model as a theory of concrete particulars, the problem of extrinsicality and the too many possessors problem. I've also responded to several key rejoinders to my arguments. There's obviously much more to be said here, more to be said about how each model squares with other elements of Aquinas' metaphysics. I'm sure you're ready to point out some of those things to me. How it accounts for the inner complexity of accidental unities and things like artifacts and the human soul. And more to be said about which responses to the rejoinders or the objections are the best way to go. and whether after all of that the expanded model still comes out ahead. But my modest goal here is to have pushed several of these debates forward, even if just a little bit. Thank you.
About 9 minutes. Francis.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was super stimulating. Appreciate that.
Cool, thanks, man.
But I'm going to try to defend the simple model.
Cool. Good.
So please push back on this. But so my worry is that you might be, there seems to be maybe too much of a dichotomy between the simple model and the expanded model. So it sounded like you were taking intrinsic and part as meaning more or less the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that that's right. So like, if I were trying to defend the simple model, I would want to say, accidents are intrinsic. If what by intrinsic you mean is not something that just kind of like stays outside the substance, but rather like gives it a new secondary accidental being, right? Belongs to the substance, suffuses the substance, goes into it, all that good stuff. But I would not want to say it's a part, at least not an integral part, because the way Aquinas understands part is, right, you put a part together with another part, and then you get a third thing, which is not predicable of either of those parts, right? So I would think that you would want to say that accidents are intrinsic in a way that like saves the things that you want to save, but are nonetheless not parts in the sense of being building blocks. And I worry that the analytical approach to this sort of thing may like lead to a predisposition to think of things in terms of building blocks.
Yeah.
So that'll be my proposal. Shoot down.
Oh, there's some really great things there, Francis. Thank you for that. Well, a couple of things, and I should sort of like, I should be clear on this, right? Sort of like when I use the language of parts, usually sort of the alarms go off because it sounds as if like material substances are almost like secondary beings, that you start with sort of like these forms, these little building blocks, and then you put them together in a sort of particular a way, and then you get the material substance. That's not entailed by the language of part, right? It's perfectly consistent with calling them parts, that they're sort of like, they're posterior or sort of ontologically derivative of the whole, right? So you could say that what is primary is the whole, and actually, to speak of the accidental forms as parts does not entail, right, that there's some sort of sense ontologically prior to that substance. No. You could have sort of parts on the inside that are sort of like, they're parts only sort of like, almost kind of like from a decomposition relation, right? It's sort of like you start with sort of the primary being, the whole substance, and you can sort of like divide and distinguish sort of within it sort of these various elements of its being. And so that on the one hand, right, so yes, if you're worried about sort of speaking of accidental forms as parts, seems to suggest that it gives sort of material substances sort of like secondary being, that they're built up out of these, the primary things are really the accidental forms, not entailed by the view, but I should be clear about that. That's not entailed by the language of parthood, and I don't have in mind that the accidental forms are in some sense sort of like primary or prior to the substance in that sort of way. But your other proposal was a really cool one, because I sort of understood, I gave a couple ideas for what it could mean for something to be intrinsic. One thing I said is, well, if something is a part, then it's intrinsic. That at least seems like a sufficient condition. If something is a part, then it's intrinsic. That seems okay. But then I started, well, there are other ways sort of which something can be intrinsic without being a part, and I sort of proposed that maybe it's like caused sort of by the internal principles of the thing. And then your proposal is something like, it's really cool because what you're suggesting is maybe the accidental form, it sort of never enters into the composition of the substance, but in some way it does sort of reach in and modify that substance, just like the way I said the individuation is sort of gonna go. Maybe each accidental form actually reaches in, right? And I mean, noticeably absent from my approach here, right, is all this stuff about the actus essendi and sort of how that stuff is gonna go, right? Not that I'm sort of meaning to exclude it, it's just that things will get really complicated if I bring this stuff in. But Francis is like, well, that complication is like crucial, right? Because there is a way in which it becomes intrinsic because it does modify the inside of the substance, even though it never enters into its composition. That's a really cool suggestion. That would be another way to sort of like get the accidents to be more intrinsic and less on the outside. Because what I'm sort of like worried about on the idea of like having the accidental forms on the outside and hearing in, they become more like garments or outfits, right? The material, and those all things seem like extrinsic to me, right? Sort of. But you're right. If they can reach in a little bit more and alter, like in some sense, the very being, not the essential being, but the sort of some aspect of the thing's being, that makes them much more intrinsic. I really like that suggestion. Thank you, Francis. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I've got a question about the expanded model.
Yeah.
And one difference between the models is that on the expanded model, I am composed of the accidents. But if you're thinking of accidents in this more contemporary way of just like all of the extrinsic properties that I might have, then it looks like I might have an infinite number of these. And there does seem something weird about being composed of an infinite number of things. Not just, you know, so you might say, well, look, you're not nuclearly composed of an infinite number of things, or you're not most importantly composed of it. But it still seems a little strange that I'm composed by an infinite number of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you think that we have an infinite number of accidents?
Yeah, why would it be infinite?
Because all the relational properties are going to count as accidents on your view, right, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, relations are funny, right? So it depends. You're right. It depends on what we do with relations.
If infinity bothers you, you could just say, like, I'm composed of, like, a shit ton of things.
To use a technical term, sure. Yeah, right. Okay, right. Yes, indeed. That's right. That's right.
Because,
You're right.
like,
You're
I'm,
right.
you know,
Yeah, indeed.
7 feet from David. And
That's
I'm,
right.
You know,
That's right.
2 feet from John. And
Oh yeah.
so it seems really
you are
weird
myriad.
to say
Yes,
I'm
right.
composed of all of those things.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't seem nearly as weird to say I'm composed of form and matter.
I'm just saying that you're a more complicated guy than other people have appreciated,
I
especially for ones of
do
simple models.
contain
Right.
multitudes.
Yeah. 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 Right.
Can't you just wave your hand and say near Cambridge properties go away?
Yeah. So you're only gonna get an infinite if they're like. I don't think you get an infinite number of parts unless they're an infinite number of other things.
Are those real relations?
That's what I was worried about too. Is it depends on what we do with relations. You could just say that sort of like the truth maker for several of the relational sort of predications about me is just one sort of form that I have. Right. Which you can do it that way. You can severely sort of reduce the number, right?
Yeah, but it's still going to be a really
I see.
high number.
That my particular height, right, is going to make me taller and shorter than a whole bunch of people.
Qualities,
Yeah.
Even just all the qualities.
That's right. Yeah, there's gonna be lots.
I've got a lot of qualities.
Indeed, that's right. Yeah. So I did not include all your concentric circles on the diagram. That's true.
No,
That's true.
You're missing some stuff.
But yeah.
Does it? And I mean, it certainly seems that Aquinas says things like you're composed of form and matter.
Yeah.
But I guess you would want to just say, well, he's just talking about the ways in which you're nuclearly composed.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And indeed, right. Yeah, for anyone who's interested, I got this on the interpretive side of things. There are all these other cool passages where you use the languages of powers to describe the relationship between an accidental form and the substance that possesses it. They're usually not sort of as right out in the open, but there are a lot of other passages in which he does this sort of thing. So, or it could be sort of a shorthand. You're composed of form and matter, and what he means by that is, well, you're composed of substantial forms and matter at the core, and then also the accidental forms.
So I have a question about this first rejoinder. So it seems like this person is
My imaginary interlocutor.
yeah. So the imaginary interlocutor. So I take it what's really different about the two views is, first of all, that the forms are internal to the thing in the extended view, and also that they're structured in a way.
Yeah.
They're layered. Well, this seems to like change the meaning of intrinsic so that it no longer means internal to. It means like caused by the principles of, which results in the structure. And I guess I'm just wondering, how is this view still the simple model? I mean, I guess if you just assert, I guess you have this view has extrinsic principles by its definition of extrinsic, and intrinsic ones. So like rationality will be, or my rational power
That's right.
will be an intrinsic principle because it flows from my essence, and my hair color will be an extrinsic principle.
Your risibility,
But
right?
according to
Will be
Extrinsic.
intrinsic in the sense that it's caused or produced by sort of your internal principles, but extrinsic in the sense that it doesn't enter into your composition.
But isn't that? I mean, can't the extended model person just say that's just my view?
No,
Because you're using extrinsic differently. Here it was being used as external to the thing.
Yeah.
That was what differentiated.
Well,
it.
with the
But now you're using it as I agree that some of my actions are caused by my essence and some others, right?
So what the expanded model can
yeah.
say is, and I have them intrinsic in both senses. Yes. I have the accidental forms as intrinsic in both senses. And I can do that actually with all the accidents, whereas you have to bring in two senses of intrinsic to even account for some of the accidents as being intrinsic. And even after that, you can't sort of make all of the accidents intrinsic.
Yeah.
So the question is whether the complication of the structure is on the inside or whether it's on the outside. You see in the diagrams, right? You'll get a complicated structure in the simple model because the substance is a part
Yeah.
of various sort of
Yeah.
structured individuals. Yeah.
I just think most people should use intrinsic and extrinsic in one way
Yeah.
and stick to it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm
And
just
if
sort
you
of
do
like.
that. It seems like this
Yeah.
introduces to the extent.
Yeah. I just didn't want it to be the case that I have like unfairly defined a term, right? And said, okay, well, here's the way that I'm going to define the term, and so therefore you have a problem, right? I wanted to be open to other. I mean, one sense of intrinsic is if everything else in the universe sort of like no longer exists, would you still have that feature? And if it's caused by the internal principles of you, then perhaps. But if it's not, then no.
Well, hair color. I mean, yeah, I don't know. What do you mean? Wouldn't I still have hair color? I mean, everything else ceases to exist. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
But
Yes. And the simple model, right?
the point is, it's not a relational property. My hair color, at least if you're a constituent.
Right, but on the simple model, it is relational. It's like sort of like you wearing a garment or you wearing a hat. Even your hair color is like that.
Yeah.
So really, right? If we get rid of
Right,
everything
so it's
but
relational.
you, then you wouldn't have those accidents anymore on the simple model.
Yeah.
In the expanded model, you would.
So unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt here. Before we thank our panel one more time, I'm going to remind us that our shift in the anthropological considerations is going to move towards the nutritive power as the next thing on the program is lunch. But let's thank our panelists.
Right.